Thank you very much. Well, the fourth plenary session is on the theme stabilization and reconstruction in the Middle East. I imagine we're meant to look at those two words in chronological order, thinking first about stabilization and then logically reconstruction afterwards. Already this morning in the remarks of Secretary Mattis and Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed and Adil Jubair and Yusuf bin Alawi and Ursula von der Leyen and Minister Trenta from Italy, we've heard a lot about the ongoing conflicts in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, rules of militia still in Iraq, and other instabilities that appear to be proliferating. There is a need, following efforts of conflict resolution, to work on stabilization and reconstruction. There's been an awful lot of talk already about what are the political conditions that would permit the investment of reconstruction in states like Syria or Yemen, and there needs to be a political dispensation that can properly receive the enormous amounts of external aid that will be necessary to rebuild these fractured and broken societies. And it's a delight for the IISS that we have on this panel three very authoritative figures from three different geographies, all of whom have a special role to play in the efforts of stabilization and reconstruction along with like-minded states. And I'll ask them each to speak in the order they appear on this panel. First, of course, delighted to receive for the second year running the Foreign Minister of Japan, Taro. I was just saying to him as he entered the hall, I imagine him to be the most traveled foreign minister in post-World War history in Japan. Anyone who follows his Twitter feed will see the energy that he devotes to his task of international diplomatic engagement, and he has given a very specially strong voice to Japan in international diplomacy in the last couple of years. Ayman Safadi, who has been in the past Deputy Prime Minister and now again Foreign Minister of Jordan, a country that, as I said yesterday, is affected by all the instabilities in the region and who has offered disproportionate support to the casualties, human casualties of the wars that surround Jordan. And it's fantastic to have with us Brett McGurk, who all of you know has been hugely active on the diplomatic scene in the coalition against ISIL and thinking through the challenges of working with the new Iraq. And there's glimpses of optimism from the government that has now been established, a president and a prime minister who have a national vision for the country that is so important, again, to instill in order for the fabric of society to be resown again. So those are the speakers, that is the subject, and with that preface, could I invite the Foreign Minister of Japan to address the fourth plenary of the IISS Manama Dialogue 2018.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I am honored to be back to the Manama Dialogue after becoming the first foreign minister of Japan to attend this dialogue last year. This year, I am here to emphasize our support for the reforms and modernization currently underway across the Middle East, as I believe these reforms are the basis for the future of the Middle East. Countries in the region are striving to overcome both ongoing and emerging challenges, including the alleviation of fiscal dependency on oil revenues, the creation of sufficient and decent job opportunities for the growing youth population, and the promotion of women's participation in society. These countries have made important progress and paved the way for reform for the future generation. We cannot let their efforts fail. Based on this belief, Japan remains committed to supporting these regional efforts, and we'd like to share our own experience of modernization and reforms. Although there is no one-size-fits-all model for national reforms, I believe there are elements of Japan's experience and these countries can use. A highlight of Japan's modernization was investment in human capital. In the 150 years following the major restoration of 1868, Japan has successfully industrialized and modernized while also preserving Japanese values. A key to this success was the abolition of the hierarchical governing system and introduction of a new merit-based recruitment system for the government that provided every Japanese national with opportunity to participate in nation building. Its most striking example may be the first Prime Minister of Japan, Hirobumi Ito. Although he was born in 1841 to a low-class samurai, he distinguished himself in the new Meiji government with his extensive capacity for negotiations and taking action in the formation of new government. His rise demonstrates how effective the new merit-based system was. Another key factor that brought about Japan's successful modernization and reform was its educational infrastructure, which was already robust even before the restoration. This educational environment gave people like Ito the opportunity to study at prominent local schools that accepted young men from a range of classes. Along with this example, there is other evidence that investment in education is important to national development. In fact, the countries at the top of the World Bank's 2018 Human Capacity Index invest a large amount in education, a commonality that has been a key to their success. Now, I would like to outline our ideas on how we plan to use our past experiences as we collaborate on reform efforts in the region. First, we are working with Middle East countries to help reform their education systems. For examples, Japan is supporting the Egyptian government to develop school activities by introducing the Japanese-style education. Last month, 35 new Egypt-Japan schools opened and are expected to contribute to the development of academic, social, physical skills through the Japanese child education system. Our system promotes balanced development of students' physical, emotional, and intellectual ability through special activities, which include students cleaning their classroom by themselves. When this system was introduced in Egypt, parents objected at first, saying cleaning the classroom is not their students' job. However, after a trial run, students started to take initiative to clean their own houses, and parents were persuaded. These special activities promote students' own initiative in their everyday lives. Second, we are assisting with vocational training programs. In Saudi Arabia, Japan has helped train over 10,000 Saudi engineers and staff through public and private vocational programs. Japan also launched a new initiative in Iraq that aims to reduce the number of weapons in exchange for vocational training and job opportunities. Finally, we would like to enhance our collaboration to empower youth for development. The UNDP's Arab Human Development Report found that almost 2/3 of young voters in the Arab region recognized quality education and better job opportunities as the top 2 priorities for the Arab region. To help achieve these goals, we would like to use a new initiative that offers future leaders opportunity to study in Japan to learn about Japan's experiences of modernization at Japanese graduate school in collaboration with universities throughout Japan. We also plan to invite young leaders from the region to Japan early next year for the opportunity to learn about Japan's modernization and discuss how the power of the younger generation can be applied to their reforms. We are excited to hear their ideas and visions and to make use of them for our future collaboration. At the Manama Dialogue last year, I expressed my unwavering determination to help achieve stability and security in the Middle East under the Kono 4 principles. Our efforts under these principles include playing an active role as an honest facilitator of peace dialogues while also working to develop human capital. There are still challenges to the region's stability, even after recent victories in the fight against terrorism and ISIL. A definite victory can only come after reconstruction. We must continue our collaboration to eliminate the root causes of instability and impediments of economic prosperity in conjunction with international efforts to address the immediate humanitarian and stabilization need. I believe successful human capital development will play a critical role to this end. I would like to conclude with the words of prominent Meiji-era educator. He wrote, "National independence must be obtained through personal independence." I believe this represents the spirit of the Meiji Restoration that we hope to share. Thank you very much.
Kono-san, thank you very much for those remarks and for reminding us of the importance of education in the long effort of building modern and effective societies. Foreign Minister of Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, Ayman Safadi. Ayman.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your Excellencies, dear friends, allow me once again to start by thanking all of you for the tremendous expression of solidarity that you've all shown us as we deal with the tragic catastrophe, tragic accident that resulted from the flash floods that they did see yesterday and resulted in a tremendous loss of life. So your support and your kind words have been a tremendous source of encouragement for us. So thank you all for that at these, again, very difficult and very sad times for us. Again, it's a tremendous pleasure to be with you here again, and I want to start by thanking our gracious hosts, our Bahraini brethren, for once again putting together yet another very impressive and very successful Manama Dialogue event, and of course great gratitude as well to my dear friend John Chapman, for him and his team for the tremendous work that they've done. Yesterday, I had the honor of delivering the keynote address that His Majesty was supposed to be giving to the forum here. And I think in that speech, we kind of laid out the end game of what we believe the Middle East should reach for as it tries to achieve peace and stability. And I think there was also in this speech a sort of a roadmap at the challenges and steps that we need to address in order to be able to get there. Ultimately, we want a Middle East free from conflict, a Middle East at peace, a Middle East that can realize its potential and create opportunity for its people, particularly youth. And to do that, we need to get over the problems that we face, and we need to be realistic about identifying the sources of threat to our region and to our people, and the challenges and conflicts and tensions that are depriving us from our right to move forward and again build schools, build hospitals, ensure that we have a whole new generation that is equipped to take the opportunity of realizing all that this century can offer. Reconstruction and stabilization are key, but you can only start reconstructing when you stop destroying, when you stop the destruction. So we need to identify what are the sources of destruction that we have before we can talk about reconstruction. And I think there is a tremendous amount of work that we all are going to have to do in order to, first of all, deal with the conflicts that are pushing us all towards the edge of the abyss, and then start thinking how we can collectively start working together to try and move forward. Again, for Jordan, the key conflict has been and will continue to be the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That conflict has to be resolved on the basis of the two-state solution that will give Palestinians their right to freedom and statehood, and give Israel the right to live in security and acceptance. And once we do that, we'll be able to start talking about how we can all pool our resources to move forward. And we all talk about peace, and we all say we're committed to peace. But the question is, are we all willing to do what it takes to get peace? And I think when Jordan speaks about peace, it speaks with tremendous credibility. We have a peace treaty, we're committed, and we continue to do everything we possibly can to make sure that we bring the parties together and we bring about the lasting, comprehensive peace that this region wants. But His Majesty keeps saying, lasting and comprehensive peace should address the legitimate rights and concerns of the two parties. It should be accepted by the people. And for people to accept peace, they should feel that they've gotten what they deserve as their legitimate rights. And again, that for Palestinians is statehood and freedom, a state on the June 4, 1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital, and also investing to make sure that Jerusalem continues to be a city of peace, that we preserve its holy place, and we make it a city of peace, a symbol of peace, rather than a hotspot for conflict. The situation is extremely dangerous now. There's a tremendous absence of political horizon. The deadlock persists. That is creating an environment of despair, which could explode at any moment, and which provides fertile ground for every spoiler, every radical to exploit with a view to propagating their agenda of hate and fear. So it is essential that we find political horizons, pool our resources, and move towards with a realistic approach that would factor in that unless we meet the Palestinians' right for freedom and statehood, this conflict is going to continue to simmer, and when it explodes, it's only going to become a matter of time. The other issue that I feel we have to talk about as we talk about reconstruction is Syria. Again, this is a crisis that has persisted for about 7 to 8 years now. I think if we all look in the mirror and ask ourselves the question, have we been following the right approach to solving the problem? I think facts on the ground will tell us no. We need not double down in positions that have gotten us where we are now. We need to be more realistic. We need to follow new approaches that will bring about a political solution to that crisis, because we all know that unless we're able to find a political solution, Syria is going to continue to deteriorate. And we're talking about fighting terrorism. And as King Abdullah keeps saying, We've defeated ISIS, but we have not destroyed ISIS. And destroying ISIS is going to require changing the environment of despair and lack of hope on which it thrives, finding a political solution to the Syrian crisis, and then moving forward with all the other essential steps necessary to triumph over this evil, which is addressing root causes of conflict and countering their narrative of hate or fear and exposing ISIS and its ideology for what it is, thugs, outlaws outside not only our religious Muslim values, but outside our all human values as well. So in Syria, what we need to do is to bring the conflict back about Syria and the Syrian people. Syria has become a battleground for everybody to fight everybody in Syria. And I think what we need to do is to go back to the basics again and say, what was the conflict about, and what is it that we can do now to bring about a political solution that Syrians will accept, that will put Syria back on track and enable us all to work together to preserving and regaining peace and security and maintaining the territorial integrity of Syria and moving forward. This is what we need to do. And then as we do that, there's the huge question of reconstruction versus stabilization. And we all heard some of our colleagues today speaking of reconstruction needing to be linked to a credible political process, and that is fine. But we need to differentiate between reconstruction and stabilization, i.e., if you are a Syrian living in Syria, whether you live under opposition or under the regime, ultimately you need a school to go to. And if we have 1,000 kids who do not have schools to go to, regardless of where they live in Syria, we're going to be talking about a lost generation who will be a victim of ignorance, a victim of despair, lack of opportunity, and not ISIS. What's worse of ISIS in a few years we'll find in those disparate, ignorant children that we've contributed to denying them their right to education. They will find a ready army to join. So stabilization is key, because stabilization means providing conditions under which people will live in dignity, will be provided for, and will have an opportunity at a decent shot in life. So I think that's an issue that we really need to focus on as we try and figure out what is it that we're going to do with Syria. We all agree that 2254 is the benchmark. We all agree that Geneva should be the venue through which we negotiate a peaceful solution to Syria. But we all need, again, to double our efforts, intensify our efforts to make sure that we have the right strategy and we have the right answer, and we're starting from the right point of departure and making sure that we do what's right for Syria and the Syrian people and mitigate to the extent that we can against Syria being just a battleground for everybody to fight everybody on Syria. The third thing that I just want to mention in terms of reconstruction is reconstructing environments. Environments whereby the youth will have opportunity. Without economic empowerment, without political empowerment, without giving the youth a chance to feel that they are part of the decision-making process, again, we'll be digging deeper into the hole. So I think it is important to look at the security, stabilization, reconstruction from a holistic approach that would factor in the political solution to conflicts, economic challenges, educational challenges, and work together to see what is it that we can do to have impact. And again, there's a tremendous challenge that we have with the refugees. In Jordan, we're the host of 1.3 million Syrians. And we have been doing, and we will continue to do everything we possibly can to meet every need of those people. Because reality is, if we don't, then we will be contributing to creating a situation that will be a threat to our collective security. These people are entitled to a dignified life. These people are entitled to schools, are entitled to hospitals, to clinics. Small as Jordan economy is, limited as our resources are, we will continue to do that. We will continue to do the right thing. But that said, I think it is upon the international community, all of us as partners, also to do what it takes and to make sure that we continue to make available resources needed to make sure that we have classrooms to which we send those kids. If we do not, again, we'll be talking about a lost generation. People will go back to their countries when there's a political solution, when they feel they can provide for their kids. There was a while ago a discussion of refugees returning or not returning, and our position in Jordan was we will encourage the voluntary return of refugees. We will never push anybody away. But the decision to go back is not going to be a function of any statement that any politician is going to make. The decision to go back is going to be a father, a mother, and kids sitting together having dinner, and they will say, do we go back or not? And the answer to that question is going to depend on the answer to the following questions. Will I be able to provide for my kids? Will I be safe? Will I be able to live in dignity? If the answer to these questions are yes, then people will go back. If the answer to any of those questions is no, then people will not go back. And that is why, ultimately, reconstructing the Middle East, stabilizing the Middle East, building the future that peoples of the Middle East demand require that, again, we go back to the basics and do everything we can to solve the problems that have continued to haunt us, starting with the oldest and most impactful conflict of all, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and then talking about Syria, and talking about Yemen, and talking about Libya. We have to have a holistic approach. Otherwise, we will not going to be able to move forward and build the future that we all feel we deserve, and we owe it to the future generations to do. I'll leave it in that, and thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Chip, and I look forward to engaging with you.
Ayman, thank you very much again for that wonderful contribution and reminding us of the conditions precedent that would allow people to return to their countries and to their societies. Could I invite now the Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, Brett McGurk, to address us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, John, and congratulations for, once again, a truly extraordinary conference. I had some remarks prepared focused on the nuts and bolts of stabilization, what we're doing in Raqqa, what we're doing in Mosul, but listening to the extraordinary presentations today, I thought I would kind of take a step back and think a little bit about what we were talking about here in Manama 4 years ago when ISIS was really on the rampage. And if you look back to 4 years ago and you look at kind of what was being discussed when we had this forum then, ISIS was controlling territory the size of the UK. 7.7 billion people, 7.7 million people were living under the control of ISIS. They were committing acts of genocide against minority groups, Christians, Yazidis, and others, as we know. They were planning major acts of terrorism in the streets of our capitals. And it looked like something almost a situation we didn't really know how to fully get a handle on. At the time, it was about a year ago now, we formed a coalition in Jeddah with about 12 countries at the time. And we determined that in order to actually take back this territory from ISIS and have a more stable Middle East and a more stable world and protect our homelands, we had to have a truly comprehensive approach. There was a military component to this, but we were going to try to do this in a different way. We were going to try to empower local Iraqis and Syrians to take back their territory, and every single thing we did on the military side had to be followed by a comprehensive humanitarian program and a comprehensive, what we now call, stabilization program. Stabilization really being the nuts and bolts of what comes immediately after the military operations. Clearing landmines, getting basic water essential services, electricity back into these areas so that people can return home. So we built this coalition in Jeddah with about 12 countries. And if you fast forward to where we are now, we have 79 members of the coalition in 75 countries, plus NATO, the EU, Interpol, and the Arab League. And just a little bit statistics on kind of what we've done. 31 of those countries have contributed military partnerships in Iraq and Syria. Almost $20 billion in humanitarian stabilization economic support has been provided by the coalition, particularly grateful for Foreign Minister Kono in Japan for about $2.5 billion of contributions over this time period. 70 countries within our coalition has strengthened their counterterrorism laws to make sure that foreign fighters, it's harder for them to travel across borders. We have 32 countries in our coalition in the daily grind of the counter-ideological message on the internet, in mosques, in our capitals around the world, which is now going on. And the results now, I think, speak for themselves. Nobody's been doing this, and I want to echo Ayman's remarks. We have a long way to go here. So nobody is declaring mission accomplished, but we have had some success. As you heard from Secretary Mattis today, the conventional military campaign in the physical space that ISIS used to control, it's really down to now the last 1%. The conventional military phase of this operation, I think it is fair to say the end is really coming into sight, although there's difficult fighting ahead in this last area of the lower Euphrates Valley in Syria. But most significantly, all the territory that was retaken in this military campaign, it's all held. I see General Petraeus here, and we worked, of course, very closely during the difficult days of the surge, focusing on clear, hold, and build, holding the territory. Because before we had the surge, we had this problem of you'd clear territory, then it would fall back to the enemy. All the territory in this campaign has held. ISIS has clandestine cells. They're trying to go underground. There's no question about that. We anticipated that. This will be a long-term effort. But they are not able now to control major territory. They're not able to generate the types of revenues they were generating 4 years ago, almost $1 billion a year in revenue 4 years ago. And I think that is because we put together this comprehensive campaign with so many partners around the world. And when President Trump came into office, he asked us to do two things. Accelerate the campaign, and he delegated authority down to the lowest level in the field that allowed us to really accelerate the military phase, and dramatically try to increase the burden sharing from the coalition. And I think we were able to do that. So I'll give you just one example, the Mosul campaign, probably one of the largest, most significant military operations in decades. The humanitarian scale was off the charts. The worst case scenario we thought was over 1 million IDPs would come out of Mosul and would need aid. That was the worst case scenario. And it turns out we had more than 1 million IDPs came out of Mosul. But because of the planning we did as a coalition, because of so many partners we had contributing to this, because of a really comprehensive program from the UN and others, I think Lise Grand is here, who's now leading the humanitarian response in Yemen, we put together a pretty sophisticated approach in which every single one of those IDPs that came out of Mosul received shelter and aid because of what we did on the coalition side. And then transition to stabilization. So in eastern Mosul, you've seen an awful lot of Iraqis go back. Western Mosul is going to take a very long time. But just on the Iraq side, because of this stabilization approach, we have 4.1 million Iraqis who were displaced from ISIS are now back in their homes. That statistic is completely off the charts in terms of conflicts like this. So 4.1 million Iraqis are back in their homes in areas once controlled by ISIS, but there's still a number of Iraqis displaced, and until they're all back, we're not going to rest. I came here last night, landed here from Baghdad. I was in Baghdad off and on over the last couple months, working on this kind of final phase of the counter-ISIS campaign, and also working with the Iraqis as they work through their difficult political challenges and trying to form a new government. And as has been mentioned here in a number of panels, they just formed a new government. We had a peaceful transition of power about 48 hours in Baghdad that I think has given a lot of optimism and hope of a government that can act in its own national interests, increase its own sovereignty and its own independence. We all owe, I think, a real debt of gratitude to outgoing Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, who took on this challenge 4 years ago. He has left Iraq in a much better place than when he came into office. And the new Prime Minister, Adel Abdel-Mahdi, who's a good, close friend of many in this room, has a big challenge ahead of him, but also has an awful lot of support and has a national vision for the country that I think we can rally behind. Similar leadership, President Barham Saleh and others are part of this government. I think there's some real hope, at least I sensed it in Baghdad when I left, and I've sensed it here today. Syria is a far different challenge. In Syria, we do not have a government to work with. We will not work with the government of Bashar al-Assad, obviously. We will not help reconstruct any of the areas that were retaken by the Assad regime with the help of the Iranians and the Russians. But we do owe, in the areas that we as a coalition helped clear from ISIS, we are focused on the nuts and bolts of stabilization. And again, what started in a small battle of Kobani and has now really expanded to almost a third of the country, working with the Syrian Democratic Forces and our partners. Those forces are now have basically control over about a third of the country. We are focused on stabilization. I've been to Syria, I don't know how many times, about 20 times throughout the course of this campaign. And the challenge is enormous, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. This is going to take many, many years. But again, focused on the nuts and bolts of stabilization in Raqqa alone. The first time I went to Raqqa shortly after the battle, I think I was with General Patel, we had found, I think from an ISIS fighter or a prisoner, a phone that basically showed where IEDs were throughout Raqqa, where they'd planted explosive devices. And basically every single structure in Raqqa had an IED. I've never seen anything like it, and we thought this is like a Chernobyl situation in which it's going to be very difficult for anybody to return here, given this extent of explosive really planted by ISIS and just the residue of war. So we worked pretty hard to get explosive ordnance disposal teams into place, and they've cleared in Raqqa and the environs about 250,000 IEDs. I've been to Raqqa now 4 times. If you go now, you'll think, my God, this is an incredibly desperate situation. But if you went shortly after the battle, the transformation from then is truly extraordinary, and 150,000 Syrians have returned already to their homes in Raqqa. That's because of this work we've done, focus on stabilization, focus with the coalition. But this is not over. I think the hardest work really will be ahead of us. Just in closing, an anecdote, a book a lot of young diplomats in the United States read by Robert Murphy called Diplomat Among Warriors, about a Foreign Service officer who was really the right-hand man of General Eisenhower in World War II, in the campaign in Europe, and then remained on with Lucius Clay in the occupation of Germany and had a very high-profile career. But talks about really after the war is when the diplomacy got most difficult, and not something that he had fully anticipated. And I think we're now heading into a period in which there is tremendous opportunity coming out of this counter-ISIS campaign, but also tremendous challenges. And the only way I think we will address these challenges is working together and building on a lot of the great work that we have done. The United States is committed to continue to lead this counter-ISIS coalition. We are committed to that. That is a commitment from President Trump, Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo. We will continue to lead the global coalition. We will continue to adapt to changing circumstances. And over the next 12 months, the focus will be on stabilization and then shifting in areas that we cleared, not others, into the longer-term reconstruction, which is something really the World Bank and others are taking a leading role on. And just on that point, we're very grateful for Kuwait, which had a very significant reconstruction conference about a year ago, focused on Iraq's long-term reconstruction needs, where about $30 billion was pledged in that meeting. And now that we have a new government, we can get on with some of that difficult work. That's the long term, over the next decade, but I think we have an opportunity. So finally, just to reflect on where we were 4 years ago, when you think about the challenges that have been discussed in this really remarkable conference today, they're daunting. But it was pretty daunting 4 years ago. And we've made an awful lot of progress, and I think we have something to build upon. And again, thank you very much, and look forward to the questions.
Special Envoy McGurk, thank you very much. And I thought it was really important not only to have the perspective that you provided in the initial remarks you delivered, but also actually the detail which you characterized as nuts and bolts at one point, but to understand quite how many IEDs were in every single structure in Raqqa gives also a sense of perspective on how enormous the reconstruction and stabilization challenges are. And I know our friend Deputy Prime Minister Sheikh Sabah Khalid of Kuwait will have deeply appreciated your word of thanks for the very important conference that Kuwait hosted that delivered these promises of aid. We now go into our dialogue. As you can see, our technical difficulties appear to have been resolved, and so please do use the system that I described earlier this morning to get into the queue, and I will call on you in order. I've got a few on my list now, and what I'll do is I'll take those and then return to the panel. But could I please ask Emil Hokayem to speak first. Emil.
Yes, thank you. As we meet here today, a tragedy is playing out in IDP camp in Syria called Rokban. There's approximately 45,000 people living in terrible conditions. Most of these IDPs have run away from ISIS and the Assad regime. And the tragedy of Rokban really embodies all the complexities of Syria today. It is located in a region that is technically covered by the US-Russia deconfliction agreement, and it sits a few miles away from the US base in Tanf. It also sits on the Jordanian border, and it's entirely dependent on humanitarian aid. The Assad regime has hindered delivery of aid for many months now. Jordan is unwilling to allow cross-border aid to go in or to take more refugees, and nearby US forces are not helping out. What I'm trying to get to here is that the collective responsibility of the international community and of the main actors in Syria has been engaged for many years, but even as we face the tragedy of Rokban, there seems to be no answers and no mechanisms to deal with something like that. How do Minister Safadi and Mr. McGurk, who are directly involved in this effort, propose to at least alleviate the suffering of those 45,000 people? Thank you.
Thanks. We'll collect them and then come back. So, General Tom Beckett?
It's for Brett McGurk. I'm just looking at U.S. policy for Syria. There's two aspects to it that I'd like to highlight. And one is that your forces are there for the purpose of the counter-Daesh campaign. But another aspect of U.S. policy is the removal of all Iranian and Iranian-commanded troops from Syrian territory while you retain yours there. It seems to me, as a former soldier, that U.S. forces now have a split mission, and do you feel strategically that the ends, ways, and means are aligned?
Thanks very much. And Bobby Goss?
Hi, this is a question for Mr. McGurk. I'm curious about where you place the importance of dealing with captured foreign fighters in the stabilization process. What is to be done with these people? It's instructive that so many of the European countries from where these fighters come seem very reluctant to take them back. Does resettling them, sending them back home, or in some ways bringing justice to them, does that count as part of stabilization in your judgment?
Thank you. And from Iraq, Lahore Talabani?
Thank you. My question is for Mr. McGurk. On one hand, you have Turkey, a NATO ally and a strategic partner of the United States. On the other hand, your relationship with SDF, which has been the only true partner in defeating ISIS in Syria. And as we know, their numbers have gone up to almost 90,000 of brave men and women combined of Arab and Kurds in the region. My question is, how do you see the future of SDF in Syria, and how do you seek to balance this relationship between Turkey and SDF, since it's known that Turkey is completely rejecting any kind of relationship with the SDF, and at times they recognize them as a terrorist organization?
Thank you very much. Perhaps with that, I'll come back. I'll ask Ayman Safadi first, and Brett McGurk, who got the bulk of those questions, and if Japanese Foreign Minister wishes to add anything, please do. But Ayman first.
Thank you, John. I think the question was on Rukban, and let me just put things in perspective for Rukban. For many, many years, Jordan did allow humanitarian supplies to go to Rukban. Actually, Jordan was the only source of humanitarian supplies to Rukban. And we did that willingly because we were convinced that there was no other safe route that will allow for those supplies to get in. And Rukban was also a source of threat for Jordan. I mean, and let me remind you, Emil, that we have one terrorist operation that resulted in the killing of 7 of our soldiers. That operation came out of Rukban. So Rukban has, we have concerns about some elements in Rukban that are not just civilians seeking shelter, that are affiliated with Daesh, and we have proof of that. And we've been able to abort other operations that were planned out of Rukban. So for many years, we did provide supplies, but we said we're not going to own Rukban. Rukban is Syrian people on Syrian territory. So it is the responsibility of the Syrian government and the UN and the international community. And last year, when we negotiated with the UN the shipment of yet more humanitarian supplies, we did so on the understanding that the UN will beef up its operation in Syria now that it can deliver supplies from within Syria, and will tackle that responsibility from within so that we do not own this problem. Now, the situation is as follows. The road to Rukban is open, both from Damascus and from the south. So the ability to supply Rukban from within Syria is there. Why should Jordan shoulder that responsibility and do a cross-border operation when it could be a cross-line operation? And why should Jordan be responsible for that? We shouldered our responsibility when it comes to refugees. As I said, we have 1.3 million Syrians. That's 20% of our population in Jordan. So we're not going to shun a humanitarian responsibility. But when it can be done by those who should do it, and given the strain and the pressure under which we've become, given the security concerns that we've had to deal with, our national security interests dictate that this is an issue that is being dealt from within Syria. That's number one. Number two, we are continuing to provide the supply from Jordan that cannot be supplied from Syria. The water that goes to the camp comes from wells that are from Jordan. There's a clinic in Jordan that continues to treat everybody who is proven to be in need of treatment. And there were some UNICEF reports lately that some kids did not come to Jordan. That is not because Jordan did not allow them in. That is because payment that used to be made to some groups within the camp that used to bring people to the clinic have stopped, and those people have decided they were not going to do it anymore. So it is not because we did not offer the treatment, that the clinic is there and it continues to offer its services. Number three, we are engaged in conversation with the Russians on a permanent answer to this problem, which is for those people to have the chance to voluntarily go back to their houses through safe passages agreements or reconciliation agreements, because Rukban is located in an area where historically it never sustained life. It is a desert, and no community can be sustained there. So the answer to this problem is to make sure that we have a mechanism by which those people will be able to go back to their cities and villages, which are no longer under Daesh. They have been liberated from Daesh. So like other parts of Syria, where mechanisms were put in place, a mechanism can be put in place to address the Rukban problem in the only sustainable way, which is to find a mechanism for those people to go back to their homes. We've just had a session of engagement, and the US is party to those talks as well. So Russia, Jordan, and the United States are in agreement that we need to re-establish Rukban for people to go back, and we're working on that. Meanwhile, until that is done, supplies can come in from within Syria. They should come in from within Syria, and Jordan, like it has always done, will not shun a responsibility. We will continue to provide water and medical services until a solution is found. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Special Envoy McGurk.
I just quickly on Rukban, if you think of a map of Syria, Euphrates River, everything north of the Euphrates River, we're kind of working with local forces. I think we feel pretty good about it. Everything south of the Euphrates River is very shaky. Regime forces with the Russians did major operations there, and then they kind of peeled out. You have ISIS coming back into those areas. You have, I'm hesitate to say Iranian-backed militias, because they're basically Iranian-commanded militias, forces that are in that area operating. So Rukban is an area which we went in to fight ISIS. ISIS is still around, and we have a 55-kilometer circle in which we said, don't come near here, mainly for our own force protection, but also it became a relatively stable area. And we're going to stay, and we're going to stay because you can look what happens if we leave prematurely. We've made that very clear. The population of Rukban has now become a bit of a, it's being used, frankly, by the regime and the Russians. They try to use it as an excuse for, well, why are the Americans there? Well, we're there for a number of good reasons, but we have offered, and we are still offering, and Ayman just confirmed this, we are ready to support cross-line access for humanitarian aid from the UN to help these people in the camp. And we thought a convoy would move as early as today, and once again, it got held up. So the question here is on the regime in Damascus and the Russians. Do they really want to help these people, or do they want to use them as something to kind of come after us? This is not a United States problem. It's not a Jordan problem. These are Syrians. We are ready to help with the UN and the Syrians through the Russians to help get aid to these people, cross-line. So we're prepared to do that. It's ready to go. The question to be asked is to Moscow and to Damascus. Should I go through some of these real quick? Yeah, real quickly, just going through on Syria. The question about the mission. The military mission in Syria is the enduring defeat of ISIS. The enduring defeat of ISIS is a critical phrase because we all know that after the physical caliphate is defeated, and again, that will happen over the coming months. We're in the final phase of that. It's very difficult because we're in the last stages where almost every ISIS fighter has a suicide belt and they have IED rings. It's very difficult fighting, but it will get done. But we've learned from history that doesn't mean you just pick up stakes and leave. The enduring defeat, we have to ensure that we do the stabilization, the hard work, so that ISIS cannot return. So the military mission is the enduring defeat of ISIS. At the same time, everybody recognizes, it's a unanimous opinion, I think, throughout the day here, we need a political solution to the conflict in Syria. And the overall civil war violence in Syria has dramatically decreased over recent months, and we want to try to hold that in place as we work on a political solution. In terms of Iranian-backed, Iranian-commanded forces in Syria, almost everybody, including, frankly, the Russians, have said they shouldn't be there. So, yeah, they shouldn't be there if we want an enduring, stable solution in Syria. So we intend to stay for the enduring defeat of Syria, and my close colleagues, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey and Joel Rayburn, who you heard from yesterday, are working very hard through Geneva and elsewhere to get the political track moving. A good question on foreign fighters. We have about 700 foreign fighters now in Syria. We are determined to ensure that these people cannot get out of Syria to threaten our homelands or yours. We're working with a number of capitals to make sure that we can try to repatriate these people. It's extremely difficult. And while that process is underway, we're working to ensure that they are housed in a facility in Syria that, to the extent possible, meets international standards, and that so these people cannot commingle and we don't repeat any of the problems we've seen in the past. That is very much underway. Just on my good friend Lahore's question, I think Secretary Mattis put it very well this morning. The only thing worse than fighting with a coalition is not having a coalition. There are a lot of issues within our coalition, a lot of disagreements. I think we have worked extremely closely with our NATO ally, Turkey, from the beginning of the campaign. We worked with them in the Euphrates Shield operation. We have plenty of issues with them when it comes to northeast Syria, but we continue to work through them. We have a very good roadmap now on Manbij, where we should start joint military patrols over the coming months. The training is underway now, and I remain an optimist here that this is something we'll continue to be able to work through. But we will remain in Syria working with the SDF, and we also will remain obviously committed to our NATO ally, Turkey.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. Kono-san, do you have anything to add, or we have another 6 questions to come in, but you might have some reflections.
Just one thing. Last year, number of refugees and IDP hit the record high after the World War II. And Japan has been supporting refugees in Syria, from Syria in Lebanon and Jordan, and refugees coming from Myanmar in Bangladesh, and other international community help them as well. But there's a limit that the government can do because, Japan is in government deficit. Many governments are running in a deficit. So I think it's high time that we need to think of something like international solidarity tax. If we put very thin tax on, say, currency exchange and give the money to international organizations directly and task them to take care of the refugees and IDPs, we could probably provide a better support for those people. So I guess not just depending on the government budget or assistance coming out of each government budget, I think we need to create some kind of international mechanism to support the refugees and IDPs. Thank you.
Well, there was a request earlier this morning about finding 21st century models of international cooperation, and we've just had one practical suggestion in that direction. I'll go back now to the 6 or 7 people who have sought the floor, and then we'll come back for each of the panelists to respond. From the US and the IISS, Dr. Kori Shaki.
My question is for Foreign Minister Kono, and I'm curious, Japan has taken such a leading role in the last 15 years in participating in coalitions, in particular for stabilization and reconstruction. I'm curious how that has redounded in Japan's neighborhood. How have Japan's close neighbors reacted to Japan taking a more visible, more leading role? Has it been helpful in managing your regional relationships, or is it an added challenge that Japan has taken on this broader role?
Thank you very much. And from the UK, Daniel Pimlott.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, what are the most important lessons that the US and others have learned from the stabilization efforts in Syria thus far? And secondly, whether you think you can have both stability and reform currently in the Levant and North Africa, and what level of reform you're willing to sacrifice in order to ensure stability.
North Africa was mentioned, so I'll ask Nedjib Fiji from Tunisia.
Thank you, John, and happy 60th anniversary. My question will be put to Jordan Foreign Minister in Arabic, if you don't mind. Al-Aziz Ayman.
Dear Ayman, I hope that you will be able
Jalal al-Malik.
to explain the decision adopted by His Majesty to cancel the annex of the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan when it comes to the Bakura and Ghomar territory.
Japanese Foreign Minister, thank you, sir, for focusing on education. Just one clarification, to what extent your, I would say, Marshall Plan on education is taken into consideration women or the education of girls? Thank you.
From Australia, Lydia Khalil.
Thank you. My question is to Brett McGurk. I was wondering about Iran's interventions in Syria, specifically through Iraqi popular mobilization units. We've had situations where Iraqi PMUs working at the behest of Iran have been working to prop up the Assad regime. So I'm wondering how the United States is addressing this with its Iraqi allies, and if you can also comment a bit further about how the U.S. is addressing Iranian involvement in the Syrian conflict more generally.
Thank you. And from the U.S., Michael Pregent.
This is for Brett McGurk. Excuse me. The question is, how is Iraq 2018 different from Iraq June 2014, especially now when you have both not only the Sunni population disenfranchised, but also the Shia population starting to feel disenfranchised in Basra. Security backslide is one of the biggest concerns that Secretary Mattis mentioned. We worked the surge in 2007. We know the most important part of the surge was the hold phase. And you talk about local security forces. What is the U.S. plan to get Sunnis more involved in local security, but not in a contract-based security apparatus, but actually being brought back into the Iraqi security forces? We now see a predominantly Shia Iraqi security force, and now we have the IRGC Quds Force militias. So several questions. How is 2018 different from 2014, especially with the rise of the IRGC Quds Force militias? What is the U.S. plan to curtail them, curb them, constrain them, and how are we working with the Iraqi government to do so?
Thank you. And Baria Al-Mudin.
Thank you, John. I have three questions for the three ministers, please. I'll start with Japan. Your role, sir, in the humanitarian efforts in this area are quite well documented and appreciated. Have you taken any refugees to Japan? My second question is to Minister Ayman. How do you see the Safaqat al-Asr, or this deal with on the Palestinian, what they call the deal of the century? How would Jordan deal with it? And to McGurk, the future of Iraq, as you put it, seems to be quite rosy, which I can't see, especially in the light of the new government that seems to be not only probably shabby, but the main ministries are not even filled. And how do you see the role of the PMU or Hashd al-Shabi evolving? How can you basically get rid of them and the influence of Iran? Thank you.
And finally from Australia, Simon Fisher.
Thank you. I have a question for the entire panel about Syria. Minister Safadi and Minister Kono, you both noted the importance of education and skills. With Envoy McGurk noting the military end of operations is in sight in Syria, when can this kind of investment and activities begin? Can it start now, and how can it be delivered? With the Special Envoy noting that the US is focused on their own areas, how do we ensure other areas are getting the aid they need and that efforts are coordinated? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to the panel and give each of them 3 minutes or so to address all of these questions, and I'll do it from right to left, as it were, so perhaps I can invite Foreign Minister Kono to begin.
Thank you. After the Cold War, Japan promoting the notion of human security, it's something in common with SDGs, no one should be left behind. And we have been trying to focus our aid to those who is likely to be left behind, who are children and women. We are providing a lot of aid focusing on children and women, and we will continue to do that, which include education for women as well. And we are taking Syrians from refugee camps who are willing to study in a graduate school in Japan for their future nation building. So we are accepting Syrian refugees from refugee camps to study in Japan, and that has already begun the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I may start with the question on Al-Baqura and Al-Ghamar, and for those who probably are not familiar with the subject, these are two parts of Jordanian territory that when the peace treaty was signed, Jordan allowed for a special regime that would allow Israelis the right to use these pieces of land. When the peace treaty was signed, Israel fully respected the sovereignty, recognized the sovereignty of Jordan over those two lots of land. But Jordan again agreed to two annexes within the peace treaty that allowed Israeli farmers usage of these lands. So we basically implemented a provision in the peace treaty. So what we did was in accordance, in implementation of the peace treaty, and when those annexes were signed, there was a time cap put on them of 25 years. And the peace treaty said either party can terminate those annexes, and should that happen, either party has the right to ask for consultation. So basically, in implementation of the peace treaty, we decided that it is in our national interest to end those two special regimes. 25 years have passed since that special arrangement was made. Things have changed, confidence have been established, and His Majesty directed the government to serve the Israeli government notice that it is no longer interested in renewing those two annexes, and we would like to end those arrangements. That said, and of course that notice should have been given a year prior to the end of to the expiration of those agreements, which will be in November next year. So we did serve notice to the Israeli government on that. We are, of course, willing to, as we exercise our right in the peace treaty, not to renew, to terminate, we will fulfill our obligation in the peace treaty to enter into consultation with the Israelis, should they ask to discuss how the termination process is going to take place. And of course, we will respect every Israeli right that exists there. Baqura is private property from Israeli citizens. Jordanian law does respect private property and recognize private property. So we will deal with that in a way that ensures that we preserve our national interest, but at the same time respect and recognize whatever Israeli rights exist in that area. So it is nothing that some people interpreted that as a violation of the peace treaty. It is not. It is an implementation of the peace treaty. And when the negotiators on both sides put a time cap, they understood fully that there's going to come a time when that regime will have outlived its usefulness and no arrangements will need to be made. That recognized the sovereignty of Jordan, and in the consultation there'll be no discussion whatsoever of sovereignty, because that's something that Israel fully recognized in the peace treaty. So that is what we did there. On the second question on the deal of the century, Bara, we'll deal with it when we see it. Ultimately, we don't know yet what is in that deal, but what we say is that, again, our commitment to peace is unwavering. What we've done for peace is something that everybody knows. We will continue to work for a peace that can last, for a peace that can resolve the conflict. As His Majesty said yesterday in his speech to this August Assembly, that we will continue to work for peace that can work on the basis of the two-state solution. No conflict has the potential of creating more tension in the region than this conflict. You're talking about land, you're talking about Jerusalem, you're talking about Christian and Muslim holy sites. All these are matters that are of concern to billions of people. So we will continue to work with the US, with our friends in Japan, elsewhere in the international community, in Europe, to make sure that we get to that peace. And we've given decent, honest advice to our American allies on what the making of the peace deal should be, and the whole world knows what that advice is, which is a two-state solution that would allow for a Palestinian state, East Jerusalem as its capital on June 4, 1967, and an Israel that is safe and accepted and secure in accordance with the Arab Peace Initiative. And let me just remind everybody that the Arab Peace Initiative has been on the table since 2002, and contrary to what a lot of people are probably not willing to acknowledge, in that Arab Peace Initiative, all Arab countries have put on the table full acceptance, full normal ties with Israel in return for withdrawal from the occupied Palestinian territories and Arab territories. So it is not a question of what needs to be done, it's a question of are we going to do what needs to be done. Israel is in the Middle East, but it has yet to become of the Middle East, and for that to happen, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has to be resolved in the only way we know how. As His Majesty said yesterday, the fallacy of one-state solution is something that we all need to keep our eyes wide open as it is being put on the table. If there is no two-state solution, then one-state solution, then Israel is going to have to determine whether it's going to be apartheid South Africa or a democratic Israel where Palestinians are going to have, within Israel, are going to have to exercise their political rights. So this is the kind of situation that we're looking at. So we'll continue to do the heavy lifting. We'll do whatever it takes to contribute to the realization of a peace deal that works. That is the promise of Jordan, that is the history of Jordan, and that is the commitment of Jordan to work with everybody to make sure that we find a peace that is going to be fair to both people, that will address the legitimate rights of both people, and that will allow conditions for all of us in the region to move forward, pool our resources, and create conditions of peace that will create the job and opportunity and decent and dignified life that we believe all peoples of the region deserve. Thank you.
Ayman, thank you very much. Brett McGurk.
Thank you. So I got some great questions on the Popular Mobilization Forces, which would be a whole panel. So let me just try to kind of hit the high notes. In terms of well, we want to try to help the Iraqis enforce their own policy. And the new government has the policy of all arms being under control of the state. And so that is something that obviously we are prepared to work with them on. In terms of on the security side, our coalition is prepared to help continue to professionalize the Iraqi security forces. If you look at where they were 4 years ago, they basically, the entire Iraqi army pretty much fell apart. We've trained about 170,000 now over the last 4 years, and their proficiency both in battle and also maintaining security has actually been pretty good, the units that we have supported. We have a NATO training mission now in Iraq, which is commanded by the Canadians, which is now getting up and running, which has broad support. So these are the kind of longer-term things in terms of professionalizing the Iraqi security forces, bringing all arms under control of the state. There are elements of the Popular Mobilization Forces that are not acting under control of the state, or they're acting under control of another state. And this is something that we hear from the Iraqis they're particularly concerned about. And for their own sovereignty, for their own independence, is something that obviously they are going to get a handle on. But what we're seeing across Iraq is the Iraqis' population beginning to stand up and push back against some of the malign influences coming from their neighbor to the east. We saw that in Basra during protests after it was not coincidental that the Basra protests began shortly after a very hard-fought political battle in which, frankly, the Iranians did not get an outcome they wanted. Suddenly we had major protests in Basra, and lo and behold, the population actually rose up and burned down the Iranian consulate. So the Iraqi population is pretty sick of a lot of the things that Iran is doing inside Iraq. That said, we recognize the Iraqis, they have a very difficult situation in their country. They need to have good relations with all of their neighbors. They need to have balanced relations with Iran. But some of the elements of the Hashid are a serious problem, and that's not something that we think. It's something that the population and the Iraqi government thinks. So we are prepared to continue to work with them and the Iraqi security forces to help the Iraqi government enforce its stated policies of bringing all arms under control of the state. But this is not something that will happen tomorrow. It's something that will take time, and that's why we have to remain engaged.
Thank you very much. Let me offer one sentence of thanks and one exciting invitation. The reflection of thanks is that ministers and ambassadors, foreign ministers and ambassadors, are often accused in public fora of these kinds of keeping to generalities. And what I think was really striking about this session was the extraordinary command over the detail of the issues that each one of our three speakers displayed, which I think should give confidence in their efforts to stabilize and reconstruct. And the exciting invitation I have to give you is our next session, which will start in 28 minutes, is on security and competition in the Horn of Africa. And when the IISS was thinking of composing the agenda of this Manama Dialogue, we reflected in the last year there had been an extraordinary debate about competition as between the GCC states and other states over interests in the Horn of Africa. And it was really essential, we thought, to have strong African voices explain their views of how the Horn of Africa was engaged with the Middle East and how the Middle East was engaging in the Horn of Africa. So while we thank these three speakers for their presentations and their command over detail, I hope you will also be returning with a spring in your step into the hall in 28 minutes for our final concluding plenary on security and competition in the Horn of Africa. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you in 28 minutes.